The first time the words, "Please, don't do that," were spoken. They didn't come from a place of drama or defiance, but from raw fear, trembling in the dry afternoon air like heat over the plains, as the whole town of Red Hollow stood frozen near the edge of the rancher's land, watching Elijah Crow, known to everyone as a quiet, iron-willed man, stand beside the weather-beaten fence with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the ground, where the truth lay exposed. Elijah had lived on that land for over 30 years, raised cattle, buried his wife beneath a cottonwood tree, and earned a reputation for being fair but unbendable. A man who spoke little yet carried the weight of his decisions, like a brand on his soul. And now the town was begging him because at his feet lay a secret no one wanted unearthed. A young woman found barely alive at dawn near his north pasture, bruised, dehydrated, and whispering a name that didn't belong to a stranger but to one of Red Hollow's most respected families. And when she finally opened her eyes in the doctor's office and croaked out what had been done to her, every breath she took dragged the town closer to a reckoning it wasn't prepared for. The sheriff wanted silence, the preacher wanted prayer, the mayor wanted order, but Elijah wanted truth. Because he had found her, because his hands had lifted her broken body from the dust, because in her eyes he had seen the same fear he once saw in his late wife's. The night a powerful man had threatened them into silence, and when the whispers spread that the attacker was the mayor's son, people began to plead not for justice, but for restraint, telling Elijah that dragging this into daylight would tear the town apart, that reputations would be ruined, businesses would collapse, families would leave, and that sometimes mercy meant letting things lie. But Elijah didn't see mercy in silence anymore. He saw rot, and as the crowd gathered outside his ranch gate, voices overlapping in panic, someone shouted, "Please, don't do that." As Elijah walked toward the old bell tower at the center of town, the one used only in emergencies, and every step he took echoed with memory, with regret, with the knowledge that once the bell rang, there would be no going back. Children peeked from behind windows, women clutched their shawls, men stared at their boots, and when Elijah climbed the steps and placed his hand on the rope, the entire town seemed to inhale at once, waiting for him to stop, to turn back, to be the quiet rancher they'd always known. But instead he rang the bell not once, but again and again, summoning everyone, forcing the truth into the open. And when the sheriff tried to pull him away, Elijah spoke, his voice steady but shaking with restrained fury, telling them what he found, where he found her, and whose name she whispered. And with every word, the town's shock deepened, faces drained of color, alliances shattered. And when the accused family arrived, shouting denials and threats, Elijah did something no one expected. He handed the evidence directly to the state marshal who had quietly arrived at the edge of town, called by Elijah days earlier, because he knew local law would bend. And in that moment, Red Hollow realized the rancher hadn't acted out of anger, but out of resolve. And as the marshal placed the cuffs on the mayor's son, while the crowd erupted into chaos, the words, "Please, don't do that," echoed again, this time from the mayor himself. But it was too late, because Elijah had already done it, and the town would never be the same again. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about courage when silence is easier, then remember to subscribe, because this is only the beginning of what happens when truth refuses to stay buried. The shock didn't fade when the dust settled. It spread like wildfire through Red Hollow in the days that followed. Because Elijah Crow hadn't just exposed a crime, he had shattered the illusion that power made people untouchable, and the town struggled to recognize itself without its carefully maintained lies. Businesses closed early, church pews sat half empty, and conversations stopped whenever Elijah walked past, not because he was hated, but because he reminded everyone of what they hadn't had the courage to do. And while the mayor resigned and the accused awaited trial under the harsh glare of state law, the young woman recovered slowly at Elijah's ranch, where he offered her safety without questions or expectations, sitting on the porch at night while she slept inside, keeping watch like a silent guardian, because he knew the town would never fully forgive her for being the truth they tried to bury. Threats came quietly at first, notes nailed to fence posts, cattle gates left open, whispers that Elijah would pay for what he'd done. But he didn't waver, and when the trial finally came, it drew attention from beyond the county, reporters flooding in, uncovering more secrets, more victims, more silence, until Red Hollow became a symbol of everything people feared confronting in their own towns. And when the verdict was read and justice finally spoken aloud, it didn't feel triumphant, it felt heavy. Because justice comes with cost, and Elijah paid it willingly, losing friends, customers, and even the church he once attended, yet gaining something rare, a quiet peace that settled in his chest every morning when he looked out over his land and knew he hadn't turned away this time. Months later, when the young woman stood at the edge of the pasture, where she had been found and thanked Elijah for believing her when no one else would, he simply nodded because he didn't see himself as a hero, only as a man who had learned that silence is a choice, and choices define who we are. And when Red Hollow slowly began to heal, not by forgetting, but by facing itself, people started telling the story differently, not as a scandal, but as the moment one rancher refused to look away. And now when travelers pass through and ask why the old bell tower stands polished and proud, someone always says, that's where the truth rang out. And if you're listening to this story right now, remember that courage isn't loud, it's deliberate. And sometimes doing the right thing means being the one everyone begs to stop. So if you want more stories that stay with you long after the final word, stories about choices that change lives, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be the one that reminds you who you really are.